Once again, I want to say welcome to today's EnRoute webinar. Today, we'll be talking about toolpathing 3D objects. I know we've had a lot of questions over the last couple webinars about 3D toolpathing. So today, Aaron Clapp will be our presenter. He is in charge of all training here at SAI, and Aaron knows everything there is to know about EnRoute. So we're going to talk about 3D toolpathing, and then after that, we'll open it up for questions. And those can be about toolpathing, or if you have any other questions about EnRoute, Aaron can cover all those as well. So we'll answer as many questions as we have time for. And then we will be recording the webinar. So we can send you all a copy of the link. We'll upload it to our YouTube page and then email everyone a copy of the link so you can review it. You can practice on your own computer while watching the video. So I think that's everything for today. So we'll go ahead and turn it over to Aaron.
All right, so I've got a small little 3D relief out here on screen. If you're wondering how to get to this stage, I would recommend that you go back a couple webinars and watch those. So if you're doing that, check those out after the webinar today. But we've got a relief here, and we've got it ready to go. Now, what do we need to do to toolpath this? This is kind of where we're going to kind of go. And then we're going to kind of shift into some tips and tricks and things that you need to be aware of when toolpathing anything 3D and EnRoute. So first thing is, the most important thing is that before you start toolpathing anything in EnRoute, you must move the piece, your finished piece, into the relief, or sorry, into the plate. So you'll notice here that when we start creating a relief, we always have to do that from the top of the plate. So as we draw, we create everything from the top of the plate. Once we've finished our relief and everything's done, at that point, we're ready to toolpath. The next step has to be to move it into the material. Now, this is really easy to do, but it can cause a few little issues. So, for example, let me just throw a toolpath on here. If I do that, and I try and move this object down into the material like this, well, in this particular case, it dragged the toolpath with it. But a lot of times what will happen is, and this is why we say to move things before, is that usually if we go to Surface, Align Reliefs, and align the relief to the bottom of the plate, sometimes, and in not all cases, it's kind of a hit and miss, but sometimes this toolpath will not go with the object. And a lot of it depends on whether you're doing some masking and other things along with that to go with this particular object. So depending on what you're doing, this will kind of throw you for a loop sometimes if you try and move it. Sometimes you'll get a scenario where the toolpath is left hanging up in the air, but then the relief got moved down. So just be aware of that. That could be a possibility. So that is why it's our recommendation is just do this as a habit. Always move your material or the piece, the 3D object that you're trying to cut, move it into the plate first before you go and cut your object. Just because you might go through this whole ordeal of toolpathing and getting everything just right, and then you drag it into the material, and then maybe that one time it decides it's not going to drag the toolpath with it. Then you've wasted a ton of time and effort. Might as well just move it in first and then proceed with your toolpathing. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go to Surface, Align Reliefs, and I'm just going to say align the selected relief to the top of the plate. That puts my relief right at the top of the plate, so then I can cut this out. So let's jump into some toolpathing. So what kind of tools do we want to use for toolpath, for 3D? You know, what kind of strategies and whatnot? Well, the two main types of toolpaths that you're going to be using are going to be either your hatch fill or your island fill. Now, an island fill is going to be better around different types of letters. So let's just say, and we'll kind of look at an example of this a little bit later, but if you had some letters and those things that you were cutting around, an island fill might be a little bit better. In this case, we're just cutting out a flat piece. Honestly, I'm just going to stick with the hatch fill. It goes back and forth, and it's very efficient. And what I can do is I can tailor my my path to match up what I think is probably best with the flow. So for example, my flow kind of tapers, or it's kind of flowing from left to right. So I'm going to try and make my toolpath go from left to right as much as I can. If I go from top to bottom, I'm going to end up with a lot more up and down movements. And so if I can prevent as many up and down movements as possible, it'll help me cut out that object a little bit faster. So in this case, I'm going to go from left to right when I apply my hatch fill. So I really don't have to do anything. My hatch angle, I'll just leave it at 0. And this is my hatch angle set right here. So if I leave this at 0, it'll go left to right. If I set this at 90 degrees, this will go vertical, so up and down. I can even do this at an angle, so 45 degrees if I want to. And if I apply this tool path, we can kind of see what that looks like. So we can see now it's going back and forth at an angle like this. So depending on the circumstance and kind of depending on what you want what you want it to look like, or what would be more sufficient is how you would choose that in that case. One thing to remember is as we apply our tool pathing, so we'll go with our hatch fill, we're going to clear everything out. We want to use a ball end mill for most of these objects. There are some cases where you can use a conic tool if you're if the shape of your slope is exactly the same shape or the same slope or same angle as your conic tool. You could use a conic tool in some cases. We have found, though, that kind of scenario is very infrequent. And so most of the time, you're going to be using a ball end mill of some kind. The ball end mill allows you to cut along surfaces and get that smooth transition between the different textures. So ball end mill it is. And I'm going to use a 1/4-inch ball end mill for this particular one. Now, when we tool path an object, it's going to be really important that we know a few things. Well, first of all, we need to know how deep is our relief. How deep is that object going to be before we decide what depth we need to choose right here. So I'm going to hit cancel, and we're going to take a look at that real quick. So if we look at our relief, oops, wrong button here. We'll just bring up the preview here so you can see it. I'm going to pull up the Precision Input Center, and I'm going to go to my scale. And it looks like I created this at 1/2 inch. So if we look at our side view, when we look at this, we are going to want to tool path this at 0.5 inches because that's the scale of the object that we have. Now, that works in this particular scenario because the relief is at the top of the plate. So that means we can just set it to 0.5 inches and it'll cut to a maximum of 0.5 inches. Now, one thing to remember, when you're cutting into a relief, it's not always going to just cut down to 0.5 inches. Essentially, what the 0.5 inches is actually telling us is it's saying, I am going to search for a relief up to 0.5 inches, and then I will follow that relief. So it doesn't mean it's going to just gouge your relief at 0.5 inches. That is going to look for a relief up to 0.5 inches and follow that relief up to that depth. All right, so in this case, that works great. Now, what would happen if we selected this object, and if we were to cut this out, we would actually end up with a fairly significantly thick piece of material, because this is a 1-inch piece of material that I have listed here. We can see that here. I've got it set at 1 inch. And so we can see that this is going to cause, when we go and cut this out with an end mill, we're going to have like a 1/2 inch of extra material on the bottom. Well, if that's not something that you want, you can either do one of two things. You can either change the material to 1/2 inch, or we could select our object and we can lower it to the bottom of the plate. So we can go align all reliefs to the bottom of the plate. So we can push it down here now. Now this allows you to cut a 1/2 inch relief out of a 1-inch piece of material. Now obviously there's going to be a little more cutting involved because we're going to have to hog out all this material up above it. But in certain cases you may not be able to get a 1/2 inch piece of material in the specific material that you're trying to cut out of. So if we were to toolpath this, what would our toolpath depth be? Well, it's definitely not going to be 0.5 inches, because if I set my depth of cut at 0.5 inches, it's barely going to scratch the surface of this relief. Because remember, that is telling the software how far to look for a relief. So if I put in 0.5 inches, it's only going to look to 0.5 inches for a relief, but our relief is way down here at 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch. So, or 1/2 inch to 1 inch. And so what we're going to want to do if we have this scenario is we're actually going to assign a depth at 1 inch depth. So let's kind of look at what that example kind of looks like real quick. So we click on our relief, we go hatch fill. Let's say I put in 0.75 depth. Oops, we do not want an end mill. We want a ball end mill. 0.75, and we'll just throw that on there. And I'm going to turn off the rendered view just for a second here. Now see what it's done. Because I didn't put it at 1 inch, it found the relief down here and just followed all the way to 3/4 of an inch, and then it stopped. So my relief is going to look incomplete. So just be aware of that when you're applying your depth. We're going to grab this. We're going to delete the toolpath. And what I'm going to do is, in this case, we're going to go back, and we're just going to set this to 1 inch. That's going to be the setting that we want to use for this. Now, hatch, as you guys know, hatch fills and island fills automatically offset 1/2 the diameter of the bit in order to account for the edge of the material. So if we take a look at this toolpath, you'll notice that we're 1/2 the diameter of the bit away from the edge. And that's natural because that's the way EnRoute is programmed to work. You always want to make sure that the bit is contained within inside of your drawing so that it doesn't overcut. Well, in this particular case, we may want to overcut a little bit, because if we do it this way, what might end up happening is, and this depends on your 3D relief and kind of how you plan on cutting it, but you may want to, or you may end up with a little bit of extra material left over on this side that didn't get cut just because of the nature of how the rounded bit is made, right? You've got that little rounded curve. It's not flat like an end mill. So there might be a tiny little lip right here that doesn't get cut quite right. So that's something we can take care of here in EnRoute. So again, I'm going to delete my toolpath, and we're going to reapply it. EnRoute has remembered my settings from the last time. Depth is 1. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to choose Apply Overcut. If I choose to apply overcut and I don't put any value in here, it will push the center of the bit right to the edge of the material, which in 90% of most cases, this is probably more than enough to get or to cover any kind of edges that you might have. So if I click OK and I zoom in, now you can see that the toolpath is going right to the edge of the 3D relief. So if there was any little bits of material left over that it didn't cut because of the shape of the ball end mill, it would now cover those areas. Also, you can kind of see what it looks like from the side view. You can now see that that toolpath goes right up to the edge, right along here. And this is kind of a weird view from the side, but it goes all the way up to the edge, and that purple line is right there. So now we know that we're going to be able to cover that completely with our toolpath. So we're going to have no edges left undone. Another way that you could take care of this is you could always run an end mill on the edge with a slightly smaller. So if necessarily size is not that big of a deal, you could always run an end mill on the inside as an internal cut, and it would slice that off. That would be another way to take care of that. But again, that's kind of more a different way to do it. I probably wouldn't. I would do it this way. This is a little bit easier because this kind of gives you that nice, crisp, clean edge. So how about our next setting? So let's go back. And one of the things I'll remind you guys is that when you apply toolpaths to an object, if you need to change it, typically you just go right-click and edit this toolpath. This doesn't really work for 3D. The reason why is because the toolpath is highly dependent on the objects that you had selected when you applied the toolpath. So for example, you have to select the relief before you apply the toolpath. So many times, if you're dealing with multiple reliefs, or if you have to select several different things with masks, and we'll talk about masks in a little bit, then what happens is that the software doesn't remember that those are the last things that you had selected when you applied this toolpath. And when you edit it and then hit OK, it'll sometimes mess up that toolpath. So just as a general rule, not always, but just as a general rule, I typically, when I make a mistake or I don't like the way the toolpath came out, I delete the toolpath and then I go back. The nice thing is that EnRoute remembers the last setting you used, so it's not typically too big of a deal to delete the toolpath because all of my settings are already set here. It remembered the last thing I applied, so it shouldn't be too big of a deal. All right, so we've got our depth, we've got our apply overcut set. Now, what else can we set in here? Well, we can set our overlap. Now, our overlap indicates how much overlap our bit is going to cut and how smooth our cut is going to look like. So let's just kind of do a little drawing here real quick. So if we take a look at here, and I'm just going to pardon my creative process here, but we're just going to do, okay, so let's just pretend this is the ball end mill, and let's use our trim tool here. There we go. Okay, so this is the bottom of our end mill, right? What happens when you overlap 50%, like that? You get this little lump right here. This little peak happens right there. So as we decrease or as we create additional overlap, so let's say if we reduce this, and I'm going to turn off my snaps here. So as we decrease or increase our overlap, so that means that we're cutting with less of the tool, that little bump decreases more and more and more. So it'll be up to you to determine how much overlap you want to cut with and how much sanding you'll need to do. So now we've had this visual, okay? So we know that that's going to happen. So how do we deal with this in our relief? Well, we go into our toolpath, and this is where we change our overlap. So typically a 50% overlap is going to give you a lot of little lines and little humps everywhere where the toolpath missed some, and that's just the nature of the profile of the tool. So what do? Well, we can go up higher. So depending on the material, depending on the hardness of the material, will depend on what you do here. So I think the maximum the software will do is 97%. Okay, 97%. That's a little overkill. 95. I guess 95 is what it allows to. So that's a little overkill. Most of the time, you can get away with 87 to 90% overlap. And that allows you a very, very smooth surface. Now, if you prefer to have the machine do more work for you, then you would increase the overlap. If you prefer to do sanding a little bit more by hand, then you could decrease the overlap, which will in turn actually reduce the amount of cut time significantly, but then you might have to do a little bit of sanding. So depends on kind of what your workflow wants to be. I've had customers doing both. So it's sometimes If it's foam, hey, maybe a little bit of sanding is not that big of a deal. If it's hardwood, you may want to have the machine do more of it. So it kind of depends on what you're cutting and what you're trying to accomplish as an overall goal. You can also have a stick effect as well. So let's just look at it and see what it looks like at 50%. So let's hit it at 50%. We'll run our toolpath, and then we're just going to do a small simulation real quick so we can take a look and see what it looks like. You know what? I'm going to have to, oh, here's another tip and trick, by the way, when it comes to, notice how those colors were really, really bright and I could hardly see anything. If I go to my setup menu and click on preferences, I can easily go to my relief tab, and I can change the orientation of the light source. So I can change it like this in order to cast a little bit more of a shadow on my relief. So having done that, we'll go ahead and retry our thing here. This should allow us to see this a little bit better. So here's our pattern, but you can clearly see these little bumps and ridges? That's the 50% overlap for you. Again, this may be an effect that you want to apply or not. If you don't, then you'd increase your overlap. So just be aware of that. So that kind of basically does it for applying a simple type toolpath to these objects. When I want to cut this out, all I would need to do is I would just need to grab this and put a routing offset on it, and I would be set. But we're going to take the next 10 minutes or so, and hopefully I can go through this quickly, and we're going to talk about some more advanced type stuff that you can do to really help your toolpathing skills in terms of getting really crazy results from things like this. So one of the things that we want to talk about is masking. Masking can be super helpful in terms of creating different effects for different objects. So now one of the things you can do, we talked about in our last week, is adding letters to our 3D object. So we can say ER here, and we could add this to our relief. And if we made a modification to the relief, like let's say we grab this like this, and actually I need to convert these to curves first. So let's say we grab this and I say create a relief, and I say create a flat relief, and we want it to be maybe a height of 0.25, apply. Well, now I've got these letters that kind of stick out, right? Well, the problem with this is if we were go and try and toolpath just this relief, just like this, it looks pretty decent here, but what would happen is our end mill would run up against this edge, and the machine would need to lift up. And so what would end up happening is that we would get a little bit of a rounded corner here, and we wouldn't get quite that sharp a corner that we're really looking for. This is just the nature of a large machine getting a bit and going as fast as it can, or whatever speed that you're setting it to, and then having to lift all of a sudden very quickly. You're going to end up with a little bit of a ramp up right here. So you're not going to get that nice clean, crisp edge. So how do we do that? Well, this is where masking comes into play. So I'm going to take this shape. We're going to hit undo. We're going to get rid of that. So instead of applying this relief, and what we're going to do is we're going to go back, and this looks awfully dark. So we're going to go back to our relief and change this up a little bit. So this kind of brightens it up for us. So I'm going to take my letters, and I'm going to create an outline of my relief. And we'll just do, for now, let's just do 0.125, just make it really small. All right. Well, now what this is going to do is this is now going to create a mask. You guys are aware of the container hole type system in EnRoute, where if I have an object inside of an object like this and I select it, this object becomes red, and now EnRoute understands that that is a hole inside of this larger part. So knowing that, we can also do the same thing with our masking. So what we're doing here is that something to know about masking is that the boundary line for the relief does not count as part of the container hole system. So if I select my relief and I select my letter E and R, you'll notice that the E should be red, but it's not. And that's because it does not count towards the container hole system. So if I want these letters to stand out, I need to add an additional contour. Now, for ease of use for you guys to see today, I'm just simply adding that a little bit offset from the surface. Normally, what you could do is you could put that line right on top of your, you could put that right on top of the 3D relief option. So for visual purposes, on our case, I'm having us offset it so it's easy to select. But now if I highlight, now we see that when we highlight it, the E is now red and the R is red. So what's going to happen when we apply our toolpath is that it's going to toolpath everything around the E and the R, and then the inside of this R right here. And it's going to leave the rest of it untoolpathed. So then that will give us that natural raised letter without having to do the ramp up right around it. And you'll see what the toolpath looks like here in a second. I'm going to hit my toolpath here. I'm going to say 1 inch. I'll say 50% overlap at this point just because it'll make it easier on processing, and it'll help us see. So now what it's done is it's applied this toolpath all the way around the object. And what's cool is that now that it's applied a toolpath right to the edge. And you know what? I need to delete that toolpath and uncheck the overcut. In this case, I don't want an overcut because I don't want it cutting into my letter. So I'm going to reapply it with no overcut. And now you can see how the toolpath is coming back and forth, but it's staying a little bit away from the letter. And then this line is going to come in and hug that letter and follow the relief along the path of the letter. So you're going to get a really nice, crisp, clean corner. So let's take a look at what this looks like if we preview it. So we'll go here, we'll hit OK, play. And now, just like that, using a masking, now we've got a nice, clean edge, and this will not give us a ramping up effect. This will be clean because remember, the tool stopped before it got here, and then the last path that it did around the object is it'll follow this, and as it does, it follows the path of relief as it goes up and down and up and down. You can kind of see how you've got deeper spots and higher spots. This is a really good way to do toolpathing in terms of an advanced letter. So now I can make letters that stand out, and they're really crisp, they're really clean, and I don't have to waste any time cutting this flat area if I don't want to. So I can use the natural material to make it stand out. So this is one thing that you can do to really help with letters. It creates an effect like it allows you to have that letter look like it just popped right out of the 3D relief. And that's kind of the effect that we're going here with the mask. So you can do this with any 3D object, by the way. I can do the reverse of this if I really want to. If I remove this outside letter and hit delete, and I only have the inside letters, and I apply that same toolpath, now it only applies to here. So now what I'm going to get is I'm going to get an E and an R that have the texture cut right into it. So if we go to preview this, now I've cut an E and an R that has a texture built into it. A little bit hard to see, but you can kind of see over here, you've got that texture built right into that letter. So that's masking. It's really easy. It sometimes can be a little bit tricky when you're thinking about different layers and things like that, but it kind of helps give you some unique effects. And that's how we would recommend putting letters on top of any kind of textured relief if you want them to be flat. Now, if you want those letters to carry the relief with them, then you might have to use the add feature and things like that. So there's different ways, but if all you want those letters to do is stand up straight out of the texture, this is the way to do that using masking. Now, one other toolpathing trick that we want to talk about before we call it here is the idea to use layers. One of the things that can be really frustrating about 3D objects and 3D projects is that sometimes you end up stacking things on top of each other too many times, and then if you need to go back and change something, you have to delete everything in order to do that. So one of the things you can do is you can use layers to try and mitigate that problem. So, for example, if I stack one toolpath on top of this, and then I put another toolpath on top of it, and then another, essentially, if I made a mistake on my first toolpath, I have to go back and delete everything in order to get back to that first toolpath. This is where layers comes in handy. So, Andy, I see your question, and I forgot to mention roughing toolpathing. I will get to that right after this. So good thing you reminded me. I had it in my notes, and I accidentally skipped over it. So we'll get to roughing. So I want to show you a quick file while I'm thinking about this. I want to show you a file that I created. It's not terribly complicated, but I've used layers to split apart all of my toolpathing in order to keep everything organized. So if I ever have to go back to it, I can easily go back to it and then change that one element inside of my job. So I'm going to hit open. I'm going to hit advanced example here. So when we first open this up, this is going to be looking kind of crazy. There's a lot of stuff going on here. I have several different layers going on here. So I'm going to turn off all layers. So I'm only seeing one layer at a time. I've got my base relief, and if I turn it on, it's the same wave texture we were using before. So I've got a wave texture going on here, and then on raised flat portion, here's what I'm doing. I'm actually using a contour to create a raised flat portion on my job. And what I've done here is I use the masking that we just showed. That is what I'm using here. I just created an outline on the letter E and the letter R so that it kind of created this nice little shape, because what I wanted is I wanted some letters to stand out on top of a flat platform. And you'll kind of see what I mean here in a second. So I took a mask, I toolpathed it, and so now I've got this nice platform to cut on. And let's just preview just this layer, just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is what this has done. Basically, it's cut out the relief all around it, and now I have a nice flat platform to cut on. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to mill down this flat platform just a little bit, and then leave, and then do a little bit of an engraved toolpath in here. And so that's what I'm going to use my other layers for. So we'll go back to our main view here. I'm going to go to my flat portion milling down. So you can see here what I've done is I don't even actually have a relief at this point. I'm not even applying this to a relief. I am just simply taking an island fill. I'm using a mask or inside, outside, or whole container system here. And I'm creating a contour cut around these letters so that this base gets milled down just a little bit. And then the last thing I did was I did some pyramid letters, and I put this on a separate layer. So now I'm going to do a little pyramid, or not pyramid, sorry. This is a V-groove letter. I labeled that wrong. I'm going to do a little V-groove cut all the way around the edge so that the letters kind of stand out. So what I've done here is that now I have split each and every one of these different things into a separate part so that together, when I turn all layers on, I get this. It looks a little bit crazy and complicated, but now if I need to go back and change something with the letters, I can do that independently. If I need to go back and do something with this milling thing that I didn't like, maybe use a different tool, I can go back and I can change that. If I did something wrong with my relief, I can go back and I can change this, use a different tool, whatever I want to do. So this gives you a little more flexibility in terms of if I ever come back. Let's say maybe you cut this out today and then a customer needs it again 2 months from now. The sign broke or something happened. And let's just say you don't have that particular tool anymore. Well, this makes it really easy to just go through, switch it out with a different ball end mill. If I was using a 1/4 inch before and that one broke and I didn't have a chance to buy a new one, and I've got a 3/16 inch ball mills, I'll use that one. Just like that, I can go in, change the toolpath, no big deal. If I had this stacked on top of each other, which is possible, you can stack it all on top of each other. The problem would be then, if I have to go back and change that toolpath again, I have to redo the entire file. Not cool. So layers. Use layers. When it comes to 3D, it can be a powerful tool. So let's go ahead and turn on all the layers and kind of show you guys what I was able to create with just a few minutes of playing around here. So we're going to preview this, hit play, and hit preview, and here we go. So nothing super fancy, but what you can see is that we have a nice texture on the back. I have a nice flat area that I've milled down, and then I have a nice V groove along the edge here. And then these letters, the E and the R, actually stand out a little bit higher than the blue section. You can kind of see that right here. You can see how it stands out just a little bit. So just using a few little tool paths like that, you can create something very, very unique out of this. So these are some pretty advanced tool pathing concepts. If you want to get into some of this a little bit more, I would probably suggest that we could set up a training session or something like that. We do offer one-on-one training, so if that's something you're interested in, you might consider giving us a ring, and we can maybe set something like this up for you. But with a little bit of playing, a little bit of organization, you can easily create very, very simple, great-looking signs, for any of your customers. So that's your 3D toolpathing. Now, Andy mentioned roughing. I forgot about roughing, so let's go back and look at that real quick. Okay, let's take the letters out of here. We don't need those. Let's get rid of these. Okay, and we're just going to deal with just the 3D relief. So we've just got the wave texture. What happens if you want to do a roughing texture? Well, that's an excellent question. What we're going to do is we're going to clear this out. Let's say I want to do actually want a 1/4 inch and then an 1/8. All right, so we're going to use our 1/4 inch ball mill, end mill and you can use an end mill if you want to with this as well. Either one will work. We're going to set our depth at 1 inch. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my ball end mill. I'm going to click my 3 little dots. I'm going to leave my hatch angle at 50%, but I'm going to go into my passes. Let's see, is it passes? No, not passes. Depths, sorry. I'm going to go into depths. And here, I'm going to define a step rough. So this particular tool, I'm going to use it as a step roughing tool. I click on that option, and then what this does right here is this allows me to offset the tool path slightly from the surface. So for example, if you're using an end mill, you may or may not want to have that end mill touch your surface because it might mar the surface. So maybe you could put in 0.02 or something like that. So at all times, the toolpath will stay 0.02 inches away from the surface, and it'll let the other tool clean that up. And that's how you would apply a rough cut. And if we apply this, and it might be difficult to see, but if we look at it from the side view, this actually probably works better with it's kind of hard to see, but you can kind of see these big lines, these big swooping lines here. Those are your cuts from the larger tool doing a rough cut. Let me show you kind of a visual example of what it does. So this is kind of just a visual example of what that tool does. So let's say you were creating a pyramid and you were going to cut this out. What does the rough cut do? Well, the rough cut essentially, if you're using an end mill, will knock down the material to look like something like this. So this is kind of the effect that you'll get when using the rough cut. Depending on how many passes you do and things like that, right? It's going to create this stair step effect, obviously offset from the surface, so it wouldn't be that close. It'd probably be something like this, right? And now, once this is done, this is the end mill going back and forth, hogging out all this material, and then the ball end mill, the smaller tool, would then just come along and clip off all these little tiny pieces. So if you do more passes, these pieces get smaller and smaller. If you do fewer passes, these get bigger and bigger. So depending on what tool you're going to use on the second half will depend on how large these get. You can do a 1/4 inch with a 1/4 inch. So you can 1/4 inch end mill, hog out all the material, then come back with a 1/4 inch ball nose, and then cut it this way. And so that works well. That's how you would set up a rough cut inside of EnRoute with your 3D. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of a taste of what's going on with 3D. Those are some things to keep an eye out for and keep mindful of. I would suggest that you watch through this video a couple times if you're interested in this kind of thing. You'll catch on to some new things. I know we threw a lot of material at you all at once, but that's the good thing about YouTube. You can rewind as much as you want. And then if you still have questions, consider maybe purchasing some one-on-one training, and you and me would get together and we could talk about this in more detail. We could spend a full hour on whatever 3D topic you like. So from here, I'll hand it over to Stuart if you guys have any questions, and we'll go from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Aaron. And like you said, we'll open it up for questions now. So if you do have any, feel free to go ahead and type them into the chat window there. And we'll answer a few of those. Looks like we have a few people typing.
There's a lot of information to be had here, that's for sure. And I'll be completely honest with you. Even from somebody who knows this in and out, from a training standpoint, the first time I actually did this on a router, there's a learning curve there. So plan on having some test pieces. What I suggest is get some of that foam or whatever, something that's easy to cut, maybe MDF, something that's cheap, that's not that big of a deal to mess up, and run some test cuts on some stuff. And just kind of see how it reacts, see how it works. A lot of this 3D stuff can be very overwhelming and very tricky sometimes. And so sometimes if this is the first time getting into it, the first time doing it, a lot of times I suggest to customers go out there and do a bunch of tests, because you'll learn a ton of stuff and you'll start to hone that. And then when the job does come in, you kind of already know what you're doing and you're not kind of in an emergency mode to try and get a nice product out the door.
Okay. And looks like we've got a couple questions here now. So let's see. Paul said, is there any way to create overcut on outer perimeter, only so as to not cut into the letters you use as an example, it would have been very helpful many times.
The only time when you can use the overcut is when it's in relationship with 3D. So anytime, like for example, if I were to draw, a square and try and do overcut with a hatch fill, that option becomes unavailable. So it's only when you're doing 3D. So unfortunately, if you're just doing 2D cutting, that overcut is not available in any of the tool paths. It's only when doing 3D, when using either the island fill or the hatch fill.
And then we had a question from Adam said, can you use the pan feature while using exit/entry mode while adjusting the toolpath?
Okay, so like, let's see here. If we apply, let's take a shape here that's not 3D. Let's do a routing offset. Let's do something a little bit bigger here. Okay, so we've got an entry exit. I believe that once we select the toolpath and going into edit entry exit, it should allow us to zoom in, zoom out. This might have been an issue in older versions of EnRoute. I do remember this not being something where you were in the edit entry exit mode, it wouldn't let you zoom in and zoom out. This is the latest version of 6.1.15, I think. Let's see. Okay, 6.1.0.20. So this is the latest version of EnRoute. If you're running an older version and you're not able to scroll in and scroll out while you're in the edit entry exit toolpath mode, I believe that's been fixed already, if that's what you were referring to.
Okay. Let's see here. Okay, so we have another question by Steven. Said, any idea as to why my reliefs occasionally disappear when they are moved, rotated, or after I delete toolpath? Mainly happens to my slices after slicing a larger relief.
On the rotation, I believe that not all 3D reliefs like to be rotated. In fact, they're kind of not meant to be rotated. But if you have to, then you might want to try turning on, to go into your setup menu, click on preferences, and turn on this option here for horizontal cutting. When you turn this option on, it allows you to rotate different things. So for example, if I were to rotate this simple little toolpath without the option checked, the toolpath will actually just disappear. It won't let you do it. So what I would try and do is, in your case, rotate the relief with that option on and see if that helps. The only problem with rotating a relief, though, is that EnRoute can't do undercuts. So typically you wouldn't want to rotate a relief like in the X or the Y. Now, if you rotated it in position, then you shouldn't have a problem there. I'm not entirely sure. We would maybe want to take a look at that and see if it's like a memory issue or just a graphics glitch or something going on. Maybe it's not re-rendering it or something like that. We maybe want to take a look at that in a little more closer detail. If all you're doing is rotating it in position, not necessarily in the X or the Y or anything like that. Yeah, we probably want to take a look at that and see. Slicing, it happens after slicing a larger relief. It could be related to something with the size of it. I'm not really sure. Yeah, we probably definitely want to take a look at it and see what's going on. Also, check your version of EnRoute. If you have the latest version, it would be a really good idea to upgrade it if you can. And if you do the upgrade, install it as a brand new folder, and then use the help and restore configuration. So if you have 2 installs, you can just copy all your settings from the previous version. That way you don't overwrite. If you overwrite, it will delete everything, all your settings, everything. So when you install the update, just make sure to install it in a brand new folder. Maybe call it EnRoute 6 new or something like that when you go to install it, and check and see if that might help. But
Okay, thank you, Aaron. Looks like we're almost out of time, but we have one more comment by Adam. Said, want to move the guidelines while in edit points mode.
unfortunately, because of the way the tool is designed, it does not allow you to do that, because the guideline is technically not a point. And so because you're in the point editing tools, it doesn't allow you to select anything that's not a point. So that includes things that are toolpath, 3D reliefs, things like that. But I can click on things. So unfortunately, that's just the nature of the tool. I can suggest that as an option for our developers, but currently you cannot do that, no. And that's just because of the nature of the tool. It's not expecting you to edit guidelines. It's expecting you to edit the points.
Okay. That clears that up. Thank you. I believe that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Aaron, for going over all that information and those questions. And as we mentioned before, we are recording the webinar, so we will upload it to our YouTube channel, and we will send everyone a link to the recording. And our next EnRoute webinar will be on September 22nd, and we'll be discussing the EnRoute component creator. So Aaron will show how to create different shells or patterns with the component creator there. Thank you, everyone, for your time. We appreciate it, and we will see you next month. Thank you, Aaron.
All right, see you later.